Well, Martin Scorsese just released Killers of the Flower Moon, his newest, biggest cinematic wombo 3.5-hour bombo. And as you'd expect from most of Scorsese's work, it is fantastic, it is impeccable, it is glorious, and you will need to use the restroom at least once before it's over. So maybe think twice about that big gulp before going into the theater. I think it's fair to say that this film is probably one of Scorsese's finest pictures, especially after a movie like The Irishman, which was another extra-long dramatic epic that had significantly more flaws.
No, please! No, please! Please!
Luckily, this movie feels a lot cleaner and more tightly edited than The Irishman, which really helped with the runtime. I'm not kidding when I say that this movie didn't feel much longer than 2.5 hours, which is an incredible accomplishment, and I would even suggest that the editor behind this film be nominated for an Oscar for their work on this. And I'd probably tie them with the editor who did Oppenheimer, which was an equally impressive display of how great editing can help smooth out the flow of a long film. But anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself. The movie, which is based on the 2017 book by David Grann, Killers of the Flower Moon, the Osage Murders, and the Birth of the FBI, is a story about a young man named Ernest Burkhart, played by Leonardo DiCaprio, who marries a young Osage woman named Molly, played by Lily Gladstone. The story takes place in the town of Fairfax, Oklahoma, which long ago used to be an oasis of Native American wealth and prosperity similar to Tulsa after the Osage discovered oil on their land. As such, many of the Osage in this community are incredibly wealthy, with whites often working under them and marrying into Osage families in order to weasel their way closer to that wealth. The narrative focuses on Ernest and Molly's relationship, and Ernest's inner conflict as he schemes with his uncle William Hale, played by Robert De Niro, to kill Molly and her family so that their wealth ultimately passes on to Ernest and his children. The first thing I should mention, as someone who read the original book when it released in 2017, is that if you're a fan of the book like I was, you need to understand this movie is not the book. Not by a long shot. There are a lot of things about the content and presentation of this story that Scorsese changed to better suit a dramatic interpersonal crime thriller, whereas the book played out more like a true crime documentary, with the author himself narrating his own experiences, uncovering the truth behind the murders by analyzing evidence and records and speaking with the modern-day descendants of the Osage victims. And while I think most of the changes made to the story work well for this adaptation, there is one major change that they made, which I think robs the film of what could have been an even bigger emotional shock at the end. In the original book, the focus was more on the Osage murders more broadly, and as the book's title suggests, it was more concerned with how these murders led to the creation of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. This is something the movie chooses not to dwell on as much, though it does mention it a few times, but it never explicitly states that these murders basically created the FBI as an institution. So if you don't know that from the book before going into this movie, then that's not something you'd learn unless you were paying really close attention. As part of this change, the movie shifts focus from the FBI agents who worked on the case, who were closer to the main protagonists of the book, to the Burkhart family and the murders perpetrated against Molly's relatives for her inheritance. One other big change from the book is that the movie tells you straight up who the bad guys are. There's no question about who did it. Whereas in the book, the reveal of William Hale as the mastermind behind the murders, as well as Ernest's involvement in them, is kept a mystery until the very end. I think this was a smart choice, as Scorsese explains in an interview he gave that you can't have actors like De Niro and DiCaprio playing characters who are supposed to be mystery characters. There's no way the audience wouldn't figure it out within seconds of spotting them. So instead, Scorsese decided to reorient the narrative to allow for a deeper dive into these characters' motivations and behavior, which I think works much better for this adaptation. If nothing else, it gives DiCaprio the chance to explore his character much more intensively. And I gotta say, He brings his A game in this film. It's tough for me to imagine him not getting at least nominated for an Oscar for this role. The level of inner conflict and contradiction and complexity on display with this character, not just in the script, but in DiCaprio's acting. I mean, God, this is some of the best acting I've ever seen from the guy. I don't know if I'd rank it higher than his role in The Revenant, but they're such different performances, where one is a much more physically demanding performance and the other is a much more emotionally demanding one. Seeing De Niro as Bill Hale in this is also a lot of fun, if for no other reason than that I just get a laugh out of hearing Robert De Niro speaking a Native American language, but also because he can play sinister villains really well. He has this paternalistic, grandfatherly charm to him in this role, but also comes across very snake-like and really manipulative. It's also fun watching this movie and not expecting the surprise appearance of other actors like Jesse Plemons, John Lithgow, and Brendan Fraser. Yeah, Whale Boy's in this movie too. They all hold their own really well, but I've gotta really give it up to Lily Gladstone. Despite not being as recognizable a name as her co-workers, she not only manages to keep up with the incredibly talented A-list cast around her, but even manages to become the centerpiece of any scene she's in. I'd like to see her get more roles from this film because, man, she really stole the movie. Even though I think DiCaprio gave the most impressive performance, I think she played her part with a lot of nuance and subtlety. I also really appreciate how much input Scorsese took from the Osage community themselves when making this project. You get the sense throughout the film that he was really dedicated to letting their story come through more in their own voice than in his, and that he had a strong interest in showing off both the tragedy and pride of this community's culture and their history in a way that doesn't come off as pandering or presumptuous. I'd say this is a nearly perfect film, but as I mentioned earlier, there is one major problem I have with it. While most of the changes Scorsese made from the book I think were great for the type of story he wanted to tell, there is one major difference that I think detracted from the story. I won't spoil it, but there's a twist ending in the book that isn't included in the film, and I can't say I really understand why it wasn't included. Scorsese makes subtle references to the twist throughout the film and alludes to it in a kind of cinematic way, but not in a way that I think anyone who hadn't read the book would register as something important. It's something that was uncovered in the book and meant to be a surprise, but in the movie it's played as just a feature of the background, and I think it ruins the impact it could have had. I recommend anyone interested to go check out the book and give it a read, because as far as twist endings go, it is one of the most gut-punching twists you'll read, and it completely changes the mood of the original ending. I don't see why Scorsese would have removed it, and while I don't think the movie is weak for not having it, I do think it doesn't leave as strong as an impression as it could have had they included it. But that issue aside, I'd say the film's just about perfect, and makes for a unique inclusion into Scorsese's repertoire of stories about how greed drives people to commit heinous atrocities against each other. I'm giving this movie a 9.5 out of 10.